I'm Cynthia Rowland, and this is episode 69 of EO Radio Show. This is the 8th in a series of quick tip episodes focusing on the details of state registration of nonprofit corporations. In previous episodes, we talked about filing in Delaware and California, which are the most frequently used by our clients, most of whom have a connection with California. Other episodes have focused on the state filings in Nevada and Arizona, Washington State and Oregon, Alaska and Hawaii, New York and New Jersey, Massachusetts and Connecticut, and then Maine and Vermont was the last one that we did. With the help of Joe Hilliard, today we look at the basic state filing requirements for nonprofit corporations when operating in either Rhode Island or New Hampshire. You can find all the prior episodes on our website or at the Farella YouTube channel, where there's a playlist just for state filing requirements. There are other playlists as well, so check in there if you want to see more of our content on nonprofit organizations. In any event, we'll work our way through the rest of the states in future episodes focusing on the nonprofit corporations throughout the country. Welcome to the EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource. Brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella Braun Martel. My name is Cynthia Rowland, and I'm a partner at Farella. I'm a business and tax lawyer with more than 30 years of experience advising clients on nonprofit and charity law. Through this podcast, our lawyers and guests will discuss a range of legal and business issues impacting the nonprofit world because we understand you work hard every day to make your community a better place to live and do business. Many of our programs focus on the basics, and at times we'll do a deep dive into narrow and complicated legal issues. Again, welcome to the EO Radio Show. We're glad you're here. As we discussed in previous episodes, nonprofit corporations are one variety of fictitious business entities. Others include partnerships and limited liability companies. The laws of all the states prescribe certain formalities that organizers of these business entities have to go through so that the entity can be regulated and subject to legal process as a person. Since business enterprises aren't natural persons, the laws have developed mechanisms for treating them like people. This is where the state filings come into play. In order for the organizers of these fictitious entities to take advantage of the protection of the laws, they have to provide notice as to the legal name, the state whose jurisdiction they are claiming for corporate organization laws, a physical address where they can be served with legal process, and certain other information. In this episode, we aren't going to dive deep into the pros and cons for where to incorporate, but instead we are focusing on the procedures of formation, standardized documents that are available, filing fees, and similar matters. As with all the states we've discussed in the past, if you do business as a nonprofit in Rhode Island or New Hampshire or solicit contributions there, even if just through the nonprofit corporation's website, the nonprofit may need to have a legal presence and be registered in those two states. So that's the foreign entity registration that we'll be talking about. Also, before we dive into the details for the procedures here, I wanted to mention that these two states, like many of the others that we've come across, have very user-friendly online forms that allow basically fill in a box with 4,000 characters or less as to the purpose and other features of the articles of incorporation for the entity that's being organized. What the fill-in form pages don't do is provide any of the legal background or legal requirements that tell you what should be in those boxes if you want your nonprofit corporation to be tax exempt. So it's very important to pay attention to the technical requirements for the type of exempt organization or nonprofit that you want to create and operate, and then proceed with the filings that we'll talk about today. Doing it the other way around, the ready, fire, aim approach is going to get most nonprofits into a big quagmire of issues that they could avoid if they had been aware of the technical requirements before filling in these forms. So, with that little word to the wise, for the details on the state procedures, I'm happy to welcome back Joe Hilliard. Joe is a senior paralegal at Farella. He specializes in formation and compliance matters for all manner of entities, and in particular, charities that are tax exempt under Internal Revenue Code 501c3. Prior to working at Farella, he worked in-house for several real estate development and management companies in Southern California, working on real estate purchases and vendor contracting. So he brings us a wealth of experience. Welcome back to the show, Joe.
Hey, Cynthia. It's good to be here again.
So let's start with Rhode Island. Starting where we always do, how do we begin preparation of the document to form a new corporation in Rhode Island?
For sure. So the Department of State Business Services Division is what governs Rhode Island entity formations. And as you discussed a little in the intro, they have a form articles of incorporation for domestic nonprofit corporations. It's a 2-page form, and it's mostly blank space fill-ins for the articles. Specifically, Article 3 allows you to set out your purpose. Article 4 allows you to set up any additional provisions for regulations of internal affairs. Their Article 6 notes your number of directors, and here they set that it needs to be at least 3, and it asks for their addresses. Unlike some of the other East Coast states we discussed at the end of last year, this does not distinguish as needing to be their home addresses, which is nice and gives you another layer of protection there. Article 7 then similarly asks for the name and addresses of your incorporator or incorporators. That would be whomever is filling out the paperwork for you. And then there's not, though, a specific section to put language for the nonprofit IRS required distribution provisions, although Article 2 could be used for this purpose. This goes back again to what you were discussing, where knowing what to put into this form before you get to the form helps if you're doing it on your own versus having someone like you and I work with you on that.
It's a fill-in online web form with these blank spaces, but no real guidance on the form itself.
It just has an open blank. Like you said, here's your text. You can only put 4,000 characters max, or I think this one's 4,000. Some of them are 5,000, just enough to, it's about 8-9 sentences is basically your max there.
Yeah, so probably plenty of room for a proper purposes clause that includes the 501c3 language and a proper dissolutions clause. And then at the end, it generates a 2-page document.
That's correct. Yeah, it fills into the squares of it to keep it that same shape. Hence the max on how many characters you can put into it.
So convenient, so much easier than the early days. But anyway, moving on. For my foreign nonprofit, if I've got an organization that's created in another state, but will be soliciting in Rhode Island or having an office there, that's a foreign nonprofit as far as the state is concerned. What's the procedure for getting that one qualified to do business there?
Yeah, so in Rhode Island, it's also a 2-page form, and it's called the Application for Certificate of Authority for a Foreign Nonprofit Corporation. It asks the basic items that we've seen for other foreign ones: the state of your incorporation, your name, and then a name to be used if the one you want is not available in Rhode Island, the purpose, your director and officer identification, including the addresses. Here, besides the 3 expected corporate titles we always see of president, secretary, and treasurer, it also notes that you have to have a vice president, which is fairly unusual to me. And then when it comes to the signatory, it needs to be dual signed. And this is where that vice president comes in, because it needs to be signed by the president or the vice president. And then the second signature needs to be the secretary or the assistant secretary. And as we discussed, both these filings can be done online, and that's actually the preferred method here in Rhode Island. As you go through the show notes and you see the facts, you'll see that on almost every page of the fact and every document. We would prefer you just do this online, set up an account, and do it that way.
It's the wave of the future. So with all this convenience at the state level, what are the filing fees? Are the costs in line with a basically do-it-yourself sort of incorporation?
It's pretty reasonable. Their domestic articles are $35 and their foreign authority certificate is $50. That's pretty simple. And again, like we just talked about online, it's set up to go through a secured setup to put in a credit card, and or if you really want to use the checking account drop-in account number. So in the States, we always see stuff about, concerns of your information getting out. I would say the States on the whole have very secure systems. There are a lot of double prompts on them. I know California, it takes about 3 or 4 hoops to pay theirs. And most in Delaware's too, you've got to set up. It's not like, I just put it in and you feel like you've just thrown it into the internet. They have some security in place.
Well, that's something to hope is robust. So how quickly do they turn around the filings?
Per their FAQ on the website, online filing should be confirmed within 1 to 3 business days. They don't have an expedite, but again, if that's their expected turnaround, that's perfectly fine. It's not like California where if you don't expedite, it's 10 to 12 business days. So
yeah, well, that's great. So transparency in Rhode Island, how much of this information, how do they compare to other states in terms of how transparent your individual information is?
It's not too bad. As we noted, the articles and the application will require names and addresses of the president, the treasurer, your registered agent, which may or may not be somebody attached to your company, the secretary, and the directors. Then when it comes to the annual filings, that you'll again have to list the names and addresses of all the directors. It's not like you just can keep populating the names, so it keeps putting the addresses in. As we did note, they require a minimum of 3 directors in addition to the officers. Directors may be officers. However, the president and the secretary cannot be the same individual. So again, you're talking more individuals involved here. On the annual, too, a brief description of the business conducted specifically in Rhode Island needs to be included, and your NAICS code. Remember, North American Industry Classification System code, and it's a 6-digit number that identifies the specific business conducted by your nonprofit.
Yeah, that's basically statistical record keeping at the government level.
With that, too, we just moreover, specific to nonprofits in Rhode Island, their report asks for a voluntary disclosure of the number of full-time employees, the number of volunteers, your operating budget from the prior year, and a checkbox for different types of funding sources received. This information here becomes public record. And again, though it's voluntary, we were just talking about NAICS being something for statistics. Obviously, Rhode Island likes to keep local statistics, but they don't mandate it as something you have to give out.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, we haven't seen that before. So annual filings, what's the Rhode Island cycle?
Yeah, so their annual reports are due between February 1st and May 1st of each year, irrespective of when the nonprofit was formed or when you registered it. So they have just a one-size-fits-all timing.
And the annual costs look pretty reasonable.
Yeah, the annual fee there is $20 for both the domestic and the foreign, and an additional enhanced access online fee of $2, so $22. As noted with the formations, they prefer this to be an online filing, although paper forms are available online on their system if you want to print it out and send it in. Really, for annual ones, we really just recommend it. It's just really push box to really just do those online as much as possible. So
does Rhode Island have a state agency that supervises charities?
If you're organized there in Rhode Island, or if you solicit there as a foreign corporation, you are required to register with their Department of Business Regulation charitable organizations and file an annual report there, which would be more tied to your IRS 990 and be more specific to what you're doing. And then additionally, if you're looking for state tax exemptions, the nonprofit needs to apply with the Rhode Island Department of Revenue Division of Taxation. Links to both of these can be found in the show notes.
Great. Yes. And I did see you have quite a lot of show notes for Rhode Island. It looks like there are a lot of helpful pages on the Rhode Island sites.
They did definitely have spent a lot of quality time in the background to make things easier for you.
Yeah. So as I noted in the introduction, I think for someone forming their first Rhode Island enterprise, definitely go and look through their websites for the background information before diving into the technical processes. So with that, let's move on to our other little northeastern state, New Hampshire. What do we do to file and get our nonprofit started in the state of New Hampshire?
The New Hampshire Department of State governs their formations. And here, too, their domestic articles of agreement for a New Hampshire nonprofit is a 2-page form and basically, again, a fill-in. The second article sets out specific object, purpose. The third article sets out, quote, provisions for establishing membership and participation, unquote, in the nonprofit, which is interesting to hear that language in a nonprofit.
Yeah, nonprofits don't always have members in other places, but it may be a feature of nonprofit corporation law in New Hampshire.
Then the fourth article sets out provisions for disposition in event of dissolution. And we talked about that with Rhode Island, where it didn't have that section specifically, where we were talking about putting it in one of the purpose ones. But here they have that set out for you. Then the sixth article is also very interesting, as it notes capital stock, if any, which would be not applicable for the cases of most nonprofits, but it still has that. Again, even though it's their nonprofit form, it has some things that you would think of more as a standard stock capital company in its form. Then the seventh article is a provision to eliminate or limit personal liability for officers and directors. The eighth article is an identification of persons associating together, unquote, to form. It has a minimum of 5, and all 5 must sign the document. And they will need to have to give a post office address as well. There's not really other IRS required specific distribution provisions in the form, though.
That's definitely an odd little form compared to many of the others.
Then for the foreign nonprofit, they have an application for registration of a foreign nonprofit corporation. This is, again, a fill-in 3-page form. The big ticket items here would be the 7th article, which notes the purpose, and it also, again, requests for a NAICS code there. And then all officers and directors, along with their business addresses, must be identified. So it's not too complex, though.
Yeah, and so it sounds like also in terms of transparency, a common question in the different states. All 5 responsible persons have to be identified. Is that right?
That is correct. And I guess to a certain degree, this is what you would look to your directors and your officers. But again, obviously, if you have directors serving as officers, you may not Like here in California, we may only have 2 or 3 people. We'll have 2 directors and one of them serving as the secretary. And so it's kind of interesting that they definitely want a more robust type of grouping for how you're putting this together than you see in other states.
That's really interesting. So what's the cost in New Hampshire for these filings?
Both the domestic and the foreign are $25. It's very, very inexpensive.
What's their processing timing?
I haven't looked into the new year, but at the end of 2023, their website noted the online processing time is 10 business days. And their last one up was as of November 3rd, they were processing October 17th filing. So yeah, that's about 10, 12 business days. And they did not have an expedite available. So you just run it through their system and
that's pretty
see
slow.
What you get back. Sort of the opposite of Rhode Island.
So what about the annual filings? What's the time frame and cost for those?
New Hampshire is very unusual. Usually, no matter whether you're a profit or nonprofit, LLC or corporation, you run on the same schedule, but not in New Hampshire. Specifically, New Hampshire, nonprofit reporting filing fee is due by December 31st every 5 years.
Oh,
that's pursuant to New Hampshire's RSA 292. And while the state knows it will send a reminder, this is a case where, because of that long lead time, it really makes sense to set up an internal calendar for your reminder. It's really the only thing that I can think of that's comparative on that would be here in California when you do a fictitious business name. It has a 5-year, but that's a very long cycle to come back for your state level filings.
Yeah, that sure is. But then again, I guess that makes it pretty inexpensive because what's the fee? You're only doing it every 5 years.
Yes, and it's $25 that next time. So it literally costs you $50 in fees for 5 years of being registered there in New Hampshire. So that's not that bad at all, no.
And let's talk about other state agencies in New Hampshire. Looks like they have some additional state filings, and maybe those are more frequent than every 5 years.
Yes. If you're organized there in New Hampshire, again, if you're soliciting or holding assets there in New Hampshire, you are required to register with the New Hampshire Department of Justice and specifically then their Office of the Attorney General, similar to what we see here in California. That's who handles it here. And then the New Hampshire Department of Revenue Administration handles all the state exemption requests for taxes on your nonprofit. They do have a very good FAQ also, which was down in the show notes. And then too, the New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits has a really, really nice state-specific overview, which we've linked to, that gives you a whole breadth of how these all work together for you there.
I looked quickly through the show notes, and I noticed in one of the website pages that New Hampshire is one of those states where the audit threshold is relatively low. In California, the audit's only required if you have $2 million in revenue or more, but New Hampshire is one of the lower states at $500,000. So if you're soliciting in New Hampshire, that might trigger an audit requirement. For relatively small organizations, $500,000 a year is not that big. Any final thoughts on these registration processes, Joe?
No, just as we go into the new year again, just remind to check and see as things update for the New Year's, as we've talked about. When it's now 2024 and certain laws came into effect that are different here. These 2 states, I did do a quick brief because we started this at the end of 2023 when we were talking about this to make sure they were all the same. On a bigger picture, for instance, we've just been talking about the IRS. Their SS4 year form to get your EIN has changed. It changed at the end of December for a new form. So always think with the new year that things will potentially change with the state. It could be a fees. It could be a simple ding in the form. I've seen that. We're not talking here, but as we go back into Idaho, I've had some Idaho forms that were changed. So specifically, we've had to have re-signed in this last week because they're now new forms that are out of date that were signed at the end of December, but then they held and didn't file them. So be aware of that, especially if you're doing paper filings, that the forms may change and you may have different issues going forward. And again, the fees may have gone up that we're talking about here.
Yeah, that's a really great note to wrap up on our first Quick Tips episode for 2024. The laws always change in January somewhere. Something is going to affect everybody. Thanks again, Joe. I really appreciate your help on this.
It's great to be here as always.
So that's all for this episode. Be sure to check out the show notes, like we said, for links to resources in Rhode Island and New Hampshire, and links to earlier episodes on the states we've already covered, if those are of interest to a listener. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Farella Braun Martel has a YouTube channel, and there are several nonprofit playlists, including the one that we're building, where all the state filing episodes are gathered in one place, and then there's other playlists for other cohesive topics. I'm Cynthia Rowland, and you've been listening to EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource, brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella Braun Martel. If you have suggestions for topics you would like for us to discuss, please email us at eoradioshow@fbm.com. That's eoradioshow@fbm.com. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, make a difference.